This is certainly very interesting for Donald Trump, although at this stage both sides are trying to claim it as a win. But it does certainly make things a little bit more complicated for the president. Now, bear in mind that he has long tried to shield his financial records, long tried to stop his tax returns being released to the public, something that traditionally, not just presidents, but anyone running for president would normally do. They would normally release their financial filings, their tax returns to show that they are in good standing. But here we have this split decision. Now, one of the parts of it is that he cannot give over those documents to the House of Representatives. The Democrats were pushing for that. That, in many respects, is a win for the president. It's being pushed back to the lower court. What is slightly more difficult for the president is the fact that the Supreme Court, the highest court in the United States, is saying that he does have to hand over his financial records, 8 years worth, to New York prosecutors. They've been pushing for about a year and a half or so for him to release those tax returns, those financial records through his accounting firm, through one of his banks that he dealt with, really to try and show what exactly the president has hiding behind his public persona. They wanted to find out if potentially criminal charges could be brought against the president involving hush money payments, money that was given to two women who alleged that they had affairs with the president. The president denies that. And those prosecutors in New York wanted to find out if the Trump campaign and President Trump himself had used money in the run-up to his election to pay off those women using money from campaign donations, and that would have violated campaign finance laws. The New York prosecutors also wanted to look at his past bankruptcies to see what the situation was there, but also to see whether or not he paid any taxes during those 8 years. So he now has to hand those financial documents over to prosecutors, something that he has for a very long time tried to stop from happening.
Has he ever explained why he didn't want to release these records?
He hasn't in as many words. He simply says that it is something that is personal to him and he doesn't feel that he has to give over those records. Of course, with so much precedent of people in the past running for office handing over those documents, there has been many questions asked. And of course, there have been media reports here in the United States, many articles put together, even books put together about Donald Trump's past dealings as a businessman before he ran for president, the way that he often used bankruptcies to try and help finance his next project. So he has certainly not wanted to release any of those financial documents throughout his whole presidency, but also in the run-up to his whole campaign, really dating back to about 2015 when he began that campaign to run for president, saying that that was something that he simply wasn't going to do, even though all of the other Republican candidates and all of the other previous presidents before him, about the 70s, they were all releasing theirs.
All right, so perhaps another victory for him is that they won't be public knowledge before the elections, and I suppose this is one of the things that he was trying to make sure. But Joe Biden, I'm sure, is going to make a big deal of this, and for him to hide, there must be something there, I guess.
That's right, and I'm sure we will see Joe Biden continuing to push on this hot button topic, something that has certainly angered the president during the course of the day. Now, the Supreme Court has ruled that essentially there are a few more avenues that Donald Trump can explore before he actually hands over that material to prosecutors. So, like you say, we're unlikely to see these documents any time before November's election. And even when they hit the desk of the New York prosecutors, they will be going to a grand jury. They won't be being released to the public. Those grand juries are secret proceedings. Documents are often not made public. The moment that we may begin to see some of the details is if the grand jury decides what they're seeing warrants them bringing criminal charges against the president. But Donald Trump has been particularly angered during the course of the day. It's a very angry response on Twitter, firing off a series of about 4 or 5 tweets saying that it was a political witch hunt, all in capital letters, saying it was political prosecution, saying that courts in the past have given broad deference, but not to me. He said it was not fair to his presidency or his administration, very much portraying himself as the victim there. He does not want to hand over those records. And like you say, we're not likely to be seeing them heading towards New York anytime soon.
It must have hurt him as well that two of his judges that he appointed voted with the majority, 7-2.
That's right. 9 justices sit on the Supreme Court. Due to 2 recent appointees over the last couple of years, appointments that Donald Trump himself has made, it is stacked in the favour of conservative judges, 5-4. And yet his 2 recent appointments made in the last few years are people who voted against him. Both of those rulings came in favour of a 7-2 majority, and within that 7 were the 2 people that he himself appointed. And he has long talked about his desire to stack the Supreme Court with conservative justices, people who he feels would be able to uphold not just his principle, but also the principles of his voters' base, those very conservative, right-wing Republicans. And yet this is something that we haven't seen happen during the course of today. Interesting to note, though, historically, 2 big cases in the past when the Supreme Court ruled that President Richard Nixon had to hand over the Watergate tapes, and also when they ruled that President Bill Clinton had to give evidence for his alleged sexual affair. Both of those times, appointees that those 2 presidents had made voted against them in those instances. So perhaps there is some precedent, but obviously not one that President Trump would like to look back on and remember.
The president calls it a witch hunt, but in court, what did his attorneys argue before the Supreme Court?
Well, his attorney had argued that not just he should not have to hand over his financial documents, but also, and this is a very important point, that he should be immune, absolutely immune from any sort of criminal prosecution while he remains in office. Now, the Supreme Court today said that even though he had to hand over those documents, they also did not feel that someone in the office of the United States President was immune from prosecution. That very much lays out how the Supreme Court currently views the scope and the power of the President. But it's interesting to note, I would say, that his attorney, after these rulings came out, Jay Sekulow, essentially said that this was a victory. Just to quote him, he said he was pleased that in the decisions that they temporarily blocked both Congress and the New York prosecutors from obtaining the president's tax records, effectively trying to spin it as a temporary win because they don't have to hand over those documents just yet. But he was arguing to a very great length that President Trump should not have to hand them over and should not face any sort of prosecution at all while he remained in office.
All right, so Joe Biden will use it, but those that support Donald Trump, I guess they're just going to ignore this as well.
Well, I'm sure they certainly will, and I think that's probably why we saw the president firing out those angry tweets. The type of tweets that he did during the Mueller investigation that led up to his eventual impeachment, but then acquittal by the Senate. He really pushed on that button of this being a witch hunt, that he was under a lot of scrutiny, that he shouldn't have to be, by the Democrats. That was his argument, that he was being unfairly targeted by Democrats who from day one had wanted him out of office. His press secretary, Kayleigh McEnany, also gave a press briefing a couple of hours ago after these rulings came out. She also saw this as a win for the president and essentially said that they were brushing it aside. She says it is a win, and she also made it very clear that not only would the president keep on fighting, but also that he had no intention of handing over those documents anytime soon. There is likely to be a lot of Republicans looking at these rulings, Donald Trump supporters in the heartland of America, in those very red Republican states, who view this in the same way that the president does, that this is a witch hunt. The Democrats have been out to get him, but hoping that it doesn't mean that he has to hand over his documents. So I think they, the president and also his press secretary, are trying to draw a line under this today and simply say, yes, these are the rulings, but no one's seeing the president's tax returns anytime soon.
All right, so we have established that he doesn't want these records seen, and this hasn't happened since Richard Nixon in the 70s. If we take out from the equation the Democrats wanting to see this because the questions that they want to raise, Why have all the other presidents and candidates before and after Nixon shown these records? Why is it so important to lay it bare?
I think essentially if you're running for public office and if you're running for the highest office in the land here in the United States, the opportunity to govern some 330 million people but also be the figurehead for the US as a superpower right around the world, you need to be able to offer that transparency. You need to be able to offer an unblemished record, a character that people can look to as an example, something that they want to be able to vote for. And I think that is why past people looking for the office of president have released those tax returns to essentially show that there are no skeletons in their closet, that they've done no dodgy dealings, that they have paid their taxes on time and in full. The president deciding not to do so caused a lot of controversy in the run-up to him being elected. There were many questions as to why he would keep those hidden, whether he was himself trying to keep skeletons within the closet to not let them out. That decision was controversial, it remains controversial, and he obviously doesn't want them released at any point up until he is re-elected, his hope, in November. So I think the idea of being able to show a clean slate, someone who is of high moral standing and pays the taxes that they should, is something that voters look to and they want to be able to vote on. Joe Biden has released his, and within this current presidential cycle, the Democrats were releasing theirs as well. But it is something that Donald Trump has decided to break precedent with.
You know, we take opinion polls with a pinch of salt, given what happened the last time and also what happened with Brexit and other things. But he just seems to be getting it from all sides. If it's not COVID-19, it's how he dealt with Black Lives Matter. And now this tax thing, it just is mounting, isn't it?
I think if you're on the president's team, you are looking at this early part of the summer here in the United States as a period that they would want to very quickly forget. As you listed, he has dealt with a lot of problems, a lot of issues over the last few weeks and months that perhaps his critics certainly feel he hasn't got right, and even some of his supporters within his own Republican Party don't feel he's got right either. The handling of the COVID-19 crisis, the handling of the Black Lives Matter protests that swept the United States. The president hasn't presented the type of unifying face that perhaps some undecided voters might want to look to. Now, of course, he's maintained a hard line that will resonate with his base. But having this as another thing will certainly making it much easier for the Democrats to argue that Joe Biden is the man. And as you mentioned, those opinion polls currently showing that Joe Biden is leaps and bounds ahead of the president, especially in some of those important battleground states, the swing states that Joe Biden knows he needs to win. We are, of course, 3.5 months out from November's election. A lot can happen. And even before the November 2016 election, all of the polls said that Hillary Clinton was going to win. And of course, we know that that was not the result that ended up happening.